Let me start by saying, well, first, Bill Cole. In fact, can I? Sorry, my voice is a little bit thin, so they'd be yelling into it. My own background is that I started off not even in social sciences, so I'm coming at it from some of these things from a little bit different background, more of a hard science background, then into social science. You'll see some of that reflected in the way we think about organizational adaptation and that sort of thing. What I wanted to focus on was something is the space that hasn't been focused on or talked about a whole lot in these discussions. Mostly when we're talking about DDD or iterative political strategies for reform, we're talking about how it's done on the ground. We look at case studies. We're thinking about building up the evidence base, or really looking at how do you get this right? What are the principles? We're also looking at a donor level. A donor's looking at, well, how do we create the right funding modalities? How do we deal with risk? How do we deal with oversight questions? What's often missed in this is the intermediary organizations. What happens inside of an intermediary organization? The reality is, any of us, and let me assert this, that it's any of us, including the Asia Foundation, any of us who started off or became adapted to a highly competitive, donor-driven, project-centered industry is necessarily heavily adapted to that environment, which means that our organizational structures, our staff skill sets, our M&E systems, our notions about risk, about value for money, about the pace of work, the way we think about who we are and what we're trying to do. No matter what we've got in our mandate and our broader ways of thinking, if we've survived in that environment and we've brought in money and we've been able to work, these things have all been shaped heavily in a direction which is what we are sitting here talking about as the traditional way of doing things, not the DDD way of doing things. And what that leads to is that it's often, if we look closely within intermediary organizations, we're often talking about pockets of working this kind of way. That can lead a donor to the assumption that you simply outsource to an organization because you see those pockets. So if we moved heavily in this direction, I'm not sure the results would be that great, because the reality is the broader part of those organizations are actually adapted to working in the old way, not in this way. TAF is no different. It's in our DNA to think in terms of political context, to think in terms of agency and development, and to operate in an iterative kind of a way. But for the last 15 years, we have integrated. We started off outside. We've integrated very heavily into the project-centered industry, as it were. When I came in '98, we were at $23 million. Today we're at $120 million. Almost all of that growth is log-framed, pre-planned projects. Now we're really good, as Steve would insist that I point out, we're really good at getting wiggle room, but we're still adapted to that industry. Now, in engagement, now this is a separate, let me go on to the relationship with DFAT. One set of things that we're doing with DFAT is going on in the Philippines. We had a different dialogue that was going on at an organizational level, and the idea was an interest on the part of a few people at a very senior level in DFAT in helping us to spread these concepts, build out the principles, learn some things, and then engage with DFAT in a strategic dialogue out of that to see if we could advance the whole process. This was unique. It was $20 million. We're in the final stages of this. So what did we learn? Well, we did something interesting. What we did is we spread the money around the foundation. We imposed conditionality. We were trying to get people to move in this direction from where they were. We spread the money around. We had a few conditions. First, work on something really important. If it's not transformative in the Philippines, way of thinking. It had to be really important for the class of problem being addressed. Secondly, you've only got 2 or 3 years to get really big results. Thirdly, we're only going to give you ridiculously small amounts of money, somewhere between $250,000 to $600,000 a year, and you're only going to get it for 2 or 3 years. And you've got to do something really, really transformative if possible. And thirdly, lastly, we required that they take part in an M&E system that we were developing that Deborah Ladner has led, which we call strategy testing, and we'll get back to that in a minute. However, what we do give you is we give you complete freedom to get to those results. And we're going to give you various kinds of support from the unit that Deborah and I lead in the form of, for example, Mark Koenig going up and supporting on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, work that was done in Mongolia, to having providing funds for Jaime to move around to these different groups across the foundation to give mentoring and advice. The results, we did about 20 different initiatives, and let me just mention briefly 3. Mark's going to talk about the Mongolia case tomorrow. That's an interesting one because we learned some things about that because we thought we were doing one thing. We thought we were doing something that we call these initiatives rather than projects. We thought we were doing something that just had to do with advancing, it was problem-centered, advancing, improving services to poor areas of Ulaanbaatar, which turns out to be a quarter of the country's population. And it turned into something different. Mark will describe that later. It's a very different kind of a way of thinking about political strategies and working iteratively. Second, we worked in, another example is we worked on the Bangladesh leather industry. Now this is an industry it's a $500 million worth of exports, and it was about ready to go down. They export mostly to the Europeans, and the problem is that it's an extremely polluting industry, the leather processing industry. Europeans are going to stop buying from them. So that was going to have a huge impact on jobs, on trade, and so on. And the idea there was to help turn that around. And I won't go into the details on that. What we discovered at the end of the day is if you could solve that problem, it actually can rise to a $3 to $5 billion industry within about five to 6, 7 years. That's really transformative. And we're talking about investing a total of about $1 million in 3 years into it. Thirdly is Cambodia in an authoritarian environment, trying to improve services in the city. Again, there's no time to go into details on these, but these were it gives you the flavor of the kinds of things we were focusing. Okay, what did we learn? First, the obvious point: if you only have the aspiration to work on fairly limited things and to achieve fairly limited things, that's all you'll achieve. The way Jaime has talked about transformative effects, and the way DFAT talks about transformative effects in the way they're talking, with very, very small amounts of money. If you have that aspiration, then you have the possibility of getting there. What we found is that parts of the Asia Foundation that we didn't think could embrace this and get there have actually achieved some amazing things in a very short time. Secondly, the amounts of money, the ridiculously small amounts of money. It turns out that in the software industry, in venture capital, on the venture capital side, they actually have a whole theory of this. You starve the venture capitalist, and they'll become very innovative and entrepreneurial. That's what we found, that if we had given more money, that we would have fallen in, can I get one more minute? Okay. That we would have fallen into very traditional ways of doing things. The M&E system that just point to a paper that Deborah's going to put out shortly on strategy testing. But then finally, let me just say, on a whole broad front of things, we found that, and there'll be papers coming out of this over the next 6 months or so, and the work that we're doing with ODI as a partner, trying to pull out these lessons learned, a range of things that have been pretty surprising. The whole business of the way we talk about risk and uncertainty, I think there's a lot to be done there. Secondly, serendipity, the role of serendipity in all of this work. We still are thinking in terms of planning and then replanning and then replanning. The role of serendipity is huge. Thirdly, there's a lot of ideology that comes into the way that we go about things. What we're trying to do is we're trying to be as pragmatic as possible in getting to a particular outcome. What we find is that a lot of hope about the way the world ought to work often comes into our thinking in what we actually do. And so there's things to be done on that front. Lastly, what we found is that still, even though we've given up the idea of a pre-planned end, project thinking still comes in that we've taken a universe which is actually complex and unbounded. Problems are not projectized in the real world. They're not bounded in time, space, and money. We're still thinking, and we're still constrained in that way in the work we're doing, even as we work politically, iteratively. We're going to try to bring out some of the things we've learned on that front. Let me quit there. There's a lot there, more to come over the next 6 months, and a lot of this will be done through the work we're doing with ODI.